It is the winter of 1230, somewhere in the rolling country between Rouen and the sea. A castle sits on a low rise above the river, its walls the color of old bone, its banners limp with cold. Inside, perhaps 150 people are settling in for the night. Most of them will sleep within arm's reach of someone else. Not because they have to, because they prefer it that way. The lord and his lady will share their chamber with attendants who curl up on rushes by the foot of the bed. The steward will sleep near his ledgers, surrounded by clerks. The cooks will sleep by the kitchen ovens. Even the dogs have their places, and they are not far from anyone. Here is the part that still puzzles historians even now, after a century of careful work in the archives. The medieval castle had walls thick enough to muffle an army. It had private chambers, locked chests, hidden chapels, and stairwells designed so that one person could hold off 10. Privacy was, in theory, available. And yet, the people who lived inside these walls, the most powerful people in their entire region, went to extraordinary lengths to never ever be alone. They slept with witnesses, they ate with witnesses, they prayed with witnesses, washed with witnesses, and in some cases conceived their children with witnesses just on the other side of a wool curtain. The question is not whether they could have closed the door. The question is why they so rarely did. We will get to the answer tonight, but only when we have walked through the whole castle, room by room, and understood the world that made such a choice not strange, but sensible. Before we settle in for the journey, if you enjoy what we do here, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps us keep making these. And if you remember walking through old castles on a trip somewhere, or if your parents or grandparents told stories of seeing them after the war, I would especially love to hear those memories down in the comments. Sometimes the best history comes from the people who stood in the doorways themselves. So pour something warm if you have it. Settle in. Dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a small fan, for that soft background hum some of you have told me helps. We are going to walk slowly through a castle in winter, room by room, and try to understand what it was actually like to live there. Not the storybook version, the real one, the cold one, the crowded, smoky, surprisingly orderly one. Chapter 2. What a castle actually was. Forget for a moment what the word castle has come to mean. Forget the Disney spires and the Hollywood drawbridges that descend on cue. Forget the polished suits of armor in glass cases in museum lobbies, the velvet ropes, the tour guide patter. A medieval castle was not built for spectacle. It was built for one reason above all others: to hold ground, to stand against a winter, to stand against an army, to stand against time. In the years we are talking about, roughly 1200 to 1400, there were tens of thousands of castles scattered across Europe. France alone may have had 10,000 at one point or another. England, perhaps 1,500. The German lands, more than 10,000 by some counts, though many were small affairs, little more than fortified manor houses with a wall and a tower. From the cliffs of Wales to the dry hills of Spain, from the cold Baltic coast to the islands of the Aegean, the castle was the most expensive, most stubborn, and most carefully thought-out building most communities would ever see. A castle was, first, a fortified residence. That phrase is doing a great deal of work. Fortified because a noble family that could not defend itself was not a noble family for very long. Residence because the people who built castles actually lived in them, sometimes for generations. You did not pop up a castle the way a modern company might lease a warehouse. You bled for the right to build it. You paid for it in years of harvests and in the labor of hundreds. And once it was up, you stayed. The shape varied wildly. Some castles were built on motte and bailey lines, with a high earth mound carrying a wooden tower surrounded by a lower fenced yard. Some were great square stone keeps in the Norman style, brutal and simple and almost windowless. Some were the more elegant concentric castles of the later 13th century, with rings of walls inside rings of walls like a small stone onion. The Welsh castles of Edward I, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech are the most famous examples. But for every Caernarfon, there were 1,000 smaller places. The working castles of working barons who could not afford marble and did not pretend to. Most castles, in fact, were not glamorous. They were leaky. They were drafty. They were never quite finished. Stones cracked in frost. Mortar gave way after a hard winter. Wooden floors went soft where the rain found a way in. The men who lived there knew this. They paid for it constantly. There is a wonderful passage in the household accounts of one English baron, a fairly typical fellow named Henry de Bray, writing around 1270, where you can practically hear him sighing as he records yet another payment to a mason for yet another repair to yet another corner of the curtain wall. Anyone who has owned an old house will recognize the tone. The work is never done. But here is what is easy to forget. For all their leaks and creaks, these buildings were the most advanced machines of their age. A castle was a machine for survival. Every wall slope, every doorway angle, every spiral of the staircase, every privy chute, every loophole, every well, every single one of these features was the result of generations of trial and error, learned the hard way, often in someone's blood. Make no mistake, the people who built castles were not stupid. They were working with what they had, and what they had was stone, oak, lime, iron, water, and the patience of a slow-moving century. Take that spiral staircase, the one you have probably climbed yourself if you have ever visited an old castle on a trip somewhere. Notice how it turns. In most castles in Western Europe, the stair spirals clockwise as you go up. There is a reason for that, and it has nothing to do with aesthetics. A right-handed defender, fighting downward, could swing his sword freely along the open side of the stair. The attacker, climbing up, had to fight with his sword arm pressed against the central column. Spoiler, it did not work out well for the attacker. That kind of thinking small, precise, ruthless is everywhere in a castle if you know where to look. The doorways are narrow because a man with a sword cannot easily fight through a doorway that only admits one of him. The windows are arrow slits because an archer inside needs to shoot out, but does not want anyone shooting back. The walls are battered at their base. That is, sloped outward so that stones dropped from the battlements bounce outward into the attackers below. We will come back to military details when we visit the gatehouse and the garrison quarters later tonight. But I want to plant the idea now. Every detail had a reason. Most of those reasons involved someone, at some point, dying because the reason had not yet been figured out. Now, who actually lived in this kind of place? That is the first question we ought to settle before we step through the doorway, because the cast of characters is larger than most people expect. A medieval castle was not a single family with a few servants. It was a small town under a single roof, or rather, under a single set of roofs. Imagine a working farm of around 150 souls. Then add a small business office, a kitchen serving 300 or 400 meals a day, a chapel with its own clergy, a guard force, a stable of war horses, a kennel, sometimes a mews of hunting falcons, a workshop or two, a brewery, a bakery, and, for good measure, a few extra mouths who were either visiting, hiding, or had simply forgotten to leave. It was crowded, it was noisy, it was rarely quiet, and almost never empty. At the top sat the lord, and very often, just as importantly, the lady. We will spend more time on her later, because the role of the lady of a castle has been badly misrepresented for the better part of 2 centuries. She was not, in most cases, an ornamental figure pining at a window for a returning husband. She was the chief executive officer of an estate, and when her husband was absent at court, on campaign, on crusade, she frequently ran the castle herself, including its defense. There are documented cases of medieval ladies commanding castle garrisons under siege. Nicolas de la Haye, in Lincoln Castle in 1217, held the place against a French invading army at the age of around 65. Blanche of Castile defended her young son's throne with sword-wielding determination. Their stories are not the exceptions some textbooks made them out to be. Below the lord and lady came the upper household. The steward, the chamberlain, the constable, the chaplain, the marshal of the stables, the master of the wardrobe, and a handful of others depending on the size of the estate. These were not menials. They were trusted gentry, often younger sons of other noble families who had been placed in the household to learn how to run a great estate of their own one day. They had their own servants, they had their own honor, and they often had more influence over the lord's decisions than any military commander. Below them, the middling staff, clerks, valets, ladies-in-waiting, pages, esquires, the chief cook and his deputies, the brewer, the baker, the chandler who made the candles, the laundress who oversaw the linen, the seamstress, the wet nurse if there were small children. Below them, the lower staff kitchen boys, scullery maids, grooms, kennel boys, watchmen, gate wardens, ordinary soldiers. And below them, the day laborers who came in from the village cleaners, water carriers, peat haulers, the night soil men who emptied the privies. We will not, as a rule, ask too many questions about the night soil men, but we will be honest about them. They mattered, and the castle would not have worked without them. Chapter 3. The Great Hall, the beating heart of the castle. Let us start, as the castle itself started, with the Great Hall. Because this room, and it really was, in most castles, a single very large room, was the engine of everything else. It was the dining room, the courtroom, the boardroom, the throne room, the entertainment hall, the place of audiences, the place of judgments, the place where treaties were sworn, marriages contracted, oaths taken, and on a good winter evening, the place where everyone of any consequence in the castle sat in the same place and ate the same food in front of the same fire. Picture this. You are standing at the entrance to the hall of a moderately wealthy English baron somewhere in the early 13th century. The first thing that hits you is not the sight. It is the smell. The smell is a fascinating composite. Wood smoke, of course, sometimes peat smoke in places where wood was scarce hanging in a soft blue haze that never quite cleared. Underneath, the smell of damp wool, because nearly everyone present was wearing wool that had been rained on, sweated in, or both. Underneath that, the smell of food, mostly stewed meat and bread, with a top note of ale. And under everything, like the bass line in a piece of music, the smell of the rushes on the floor, which were sweet for the first few days after they were laid down and, well, less sweet thereafter. Those who lived through the rationing years of the war, or who remember their grandparents' farmhouses before central heating, will recognize some of this. The combination of wood smoke and damp wool is not a medieval invention, but the rushes that was particular. Floors of stone or rammed earth were cold and unforgiving, so they were covered, sometimes daily in the great houses, with armfuls of cut rushes from the marshes, freshened with sweet herbs, lavender, rosemary, sweet flag, occasionally even rose petals in the very grand households. The rushes were swept up and replaced when they became foul, which, in a hall full of dogs, drunken guests, and small children, was often. The Dutch philosopher Erasmus, writing about English halls in the early 1500s, complained bitterly about the practice by his time. The rushes were sometimes left down for years, accumulating, as he delicately put it, everything that is nasty. It was not always so bad, but it was rarely as fresh as we might wish. In the center of the hall, and this is one of those details that surprises people, sat the fire. Not against a wall in a fireplace, in the middle of the floor, in an open rectangular hearth with iron andirons holding the logs, and a hood of timber and plaster called a louvre set high in the ceiling above to let the smoke find its way out. This arrangement persisted long after fireplaces and chimneys had been invented. There is a question hidden in that fact, and it ties back to what we were talking about earlier. The technology for a wall-mounted fireplace with a proper chimney existed by the 12th century. By the late 13th, it was common in private chambers. So why did castle builders keep the central hearth in the hall for another 200 years? We will come back to that when we talk about the Lord's chamber. There is a thread here we are slowly pulling on, and it has to do with how medieval people thought about being together. But first, we need to understand what actually went on in the hall. A great hall ran on a schedule, and the schedule was built around two main meals: dinner, which was the larger meal, taken around 10 or 11 in the morning, and supper, taken in the late afternoon before the light failed. There was no breakfast, in the modern sense, in most great households. People might break their fast on a piece of bread and a draught of weak ale. Or, in some pious houses, nothing at all until after the morning mass. The serious eating started later, when the work of the day was already well underway. Those who remember the working hours of farm life before electricity will recognize the rhythm. You got up in the dark, worked through the cold of the dawn, and ate when the sun was properly up. The seating arrangement in the hall was a map of the social order, and it was followed with a seriousness modern people sometimes find difficult to grasp. The lord and lady sat at the high table, on the raised dais at the far end of the hall, often beneath a canopy of cloth, a literal canopy, hanging from the wall or the ceiling, marking out the space above them as set apart. To one side of the Lord sat the most honored guest, or the most senior member of the household, often the chaplain. To his other side, his wife. To her side, the next in dignity, and so on, down the table and then down the hall. The phrase "below the salt" comes from this arrangement. A large silver or pewter salt cellar, often a small architectural piece in its own right, was placed on the high table, near the Lord. If you sat on the Lord's side of the salt, you were a person of standing. If you sat below it, on the long side benches stretching down into the body of the hall, you were a person of lesser rank. The further from the salt you sat, the closer to the smoky door, the more draughty your bench, the less honored your place. There was no need to announce any of this. Everyone could read the room literally at a glance. The meal itself was a more orderly thing than its reputation suggests. The notion of medieval feasts as drunken free-for-alls with people throwing chicken bones over their shoulders is largely a Hollywood invention. The reality was closer to a regimental mess in a peacetime army: strict hierarchy, ritualized serving, careful manners, and a great deal of unspoken protocol. People did throw bones to the dogs under the table, yes, but not over their shoulders. And the dogs were not strays. They belonged to the Lord, and they had their own ranks. Before anyone sat down, hands were washed. A page or junior household member would come round with an aquamanile, a small bronze or brass pitcher, often shaped like a lion or a horse, and a basin and a linen towel. Each guest, in order of rank, held out their hands, and had water poured over them. This was not just hygiene, though it was that, too. It was ritual. You did not eat with strangers without first performing the small communal courtesy of cleanliness. And in a world where the fork was still mostly unknown in Northern Europe, where most food was eaten with the right hand and a knife you brought yourself, clean hands mattered. Once everyone was seated, the food came in courses. But the medieval idea of a course was different from ours. A single course in a great household might mean a dozen different dishes brought out together, set down along the table, and shared among groups of 2 or 3. You ate from what was nearest, with whoever sat beside you. The carver, a senior household officer with the particular title of carver, stood at the Lord's elbow and prepared the meat. Carving was an art with its own vocabulary. You displayed a swan, you broke a deer, you splatted a pike. Pages spent years learning to do it correctly. Get it wrong in front of an honored guest, and your career could end before supper. The plate, by the way, was often not a plate. It was a trencher, a thick slab of stale bread, cut a few days old, used as both plate and napkin. You ladled your stew onto the trencher. You cut your meat onto the trencher. The bread soaked up the juices and grew rich and dense as the meal went on. At the end, the upper classes might eat the trencher, gravy and all. More commonly, it was collected by household servants and given to the poor at the gate. There were people in the village whose weekly diet depended on what the Lord's hall did not finish. We will come back to that when we talk about the gate and the village outside it, because the relationship between castle and village was less one-sided than most people imagine. About the dogs. Every great hall had them, and they were not pets in the modern sense. They were working animals, hunting hounds, greyhounds for the chase, mastiffs for guard duty, small terriers for the kitchen and the rat problems. They came into the hall, they lay beneath the tables, they ate what fell. Their presence in the hall was not a lapse of manners. It was the natural state of things. The line between human living space and animal living space was much thinner than we are now used to. A dog by the fire was not unusual. A small pet monkey on a noblewoman's shoulder was unusual, but not unheard of. A pair of hawks on a perch by the door was, in some households, perfectly normal. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because the Great Hall was not just for eating. It was, on most working days, the office of the estate. After dinner was cleared away and the clearing was substantial, trestles were broken down, benches pushed back, rushes swept. The same room became something closer to a courtroom and a town hall combined. The Lord, sitting in his high seat with the steward at his elbow, heard the business of the day. Disputes between tenants, complaints from the village, requests for permission to marry, to travel, to mill grain at a different mill, petitions for justice, reports from the bailiff about the state of the harvest. This part of medieval life is hard for us to imagine because we are used to a world where justice happens somewhere else, in a courthouse, in front of a judge we do not know, who has never met us and never will. In a medieval barony, the Lord was the judge for most ordinary matters, and the people in front of him were not strangers. He knew their fathers. He knew their fields. He knew, sometimes uncomfortably, exactly what their grandparents had done in some old quarrel 40 years before. Justice was personal. It was slow. It was sometimes unfair, sometimes corrupt, sometimes surprisingly humane. And it took place in the same room where, an hour earlier, the Lord had been eating bread and stew with his guests. Chapter 4. Threatening in the hall. Light, music, and the long sit. Picture this. The afternoon's business is done. The shutters have been pulled tight against the early dark of a December evening. Servants have lit the candles, tallow candles for the most part, made from rendered animal fat, with the more expensive beeswax reserved for the chapel and the Lord's chamber. The hearth is built up. The dogs have eaten. The air smells of smoke and beeswax and something stewing for tomorrow somewhere in the kitchen wing. And the household, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, settles in for the long sit between supper and bed. About the light. We have to talk about light, because it shaped medieval evenings in ways modern people have to make an effort to understand. When you flip a light switch tonight, you summon a level of illumination that would have astonished anyone in a 13th century hall. A single modern reading lamp produces more light than the entire candle budget of a small castle. A great hall might burn 10 or 12 candles at full strength on an ordinary evening, perhaps 20 for a feast. The light they gave was warm, soft, low, and uneven. It made the painted walls glow. It made the carved oak beams gleam. It made faces beautiful and shadows deep. And it made reading, in any sustained way, an act of considerable patience. Spectacles, by the way, did not exist in Europe until roughly the end of the 13th century, and even then only for the very wealthy. If you were over 50, and your eyes were going, and most people's eyes were going, between the smoke and the poor light, and the years of squinting at parchment by tallow flame, you simply could not read after dark. So the evenings were not about reading. They were about listening. And listening, in a medieval hall, was a serious art. A minstrel, sometimes a household minstrel who lived with the family, more often a traveling one who appeared at the gate looking for a meal and a place to sleep in exchange for an evening's entertainment, would sing the long songs. The chansons de geste, the deeds of Charlemagne and Roland, the tale of Arthur and his knights, the story of how Tristan loved Isolde and how it ended badly for both. These were not short performances. A serious chanson could run for hours, broken into sections, sung in a half-chanted style that modern people would find difficult to follow, but that medieval listeners followed with the same attention people once gave to long radio dramas in the days before television. For those of you who remember sitting around a radio in the kitchen of an evening, listening to a serial drama or a long broadcast perhaps during the war years, or in the early Cold War evenings before television took over, you have some sense of the rhythm. The whole room listening together, the slow build, the willingness to sit for a long time with a single voice. That experience, which has nearly vanished from modern life, was the ordinary evening entertainment of medieval people from peasant to king. I would be curious to hear, in the comments below, what you or your parents remember about those long listened-to broadcasts. There is more in common between that experience and a medieval hall than most people would guess. When the songs ended, the games began. Chess was popular and serious, taken with the kind of grave attention modern people give to bridge tournaments. Dice were universal, despite repeated bans by the church, and despite the fact that they bankrupted a steady stream of knights and squires every generation. Backgammon, called tables in medieval England, was widely played. The ladies sewed. The men talked about the hunt. The chaplain, if he was a sociable sort, played a game or two, and then retired early to read his breviary by the only really decent lamp in the building. And somewhere in the corner of the hall, a couple of pages and a hound were probably curled up asleep on the floor, on top of a pile of cloaks, perfectly comfortable. This brings us back to the question I planted at the beginning, because here, right here, in the late hours of a winter evening, you see one of the strangest, most easily missed features of medieval castle life. The hall did not empty when the Lord went to bed. Many people simply stayed where they were. They did not go to private rooms. They had no private rooms to go to. They unrolled blankets on the rush-strewn floor, pulled cloaks over their heads, and slept in the same hall they had eaten dinner in. The pages slept by the door. The dogs slept by the hearth. The trusted servants slept along the walls. The lower household, the men-at-arms, the visiting messengers, the traveling merchants, the chaplain's clerks, they all slept in the hall, together. This is the central puzzle of medieval domestic life, and it is the question I want you to hold on to as we move through the rest of tonight's journey. We will get closer to its answer in a little while when we visit the Lord's chamber and see how even the most powerful person in the castle slept, surrounded by his household. But before we go there, we need to understand where the food came from, because the Great Hall was the place where everything came together, but the kitchen was where it all began. Chapter 5. The Kitchen. Where the castle was fed. The kitchen of a medieval castle was, by any honest reckoning, a place of extraordinary heat, smoke, smell, and pressure. If the Great Hall was the calm public face of the household, the kitchen was its sweating, swearing engine room. In the larger castles, the kitchen was built as a separate structure entirely, or attached to the main hall by a covered passage, for one very practical reason: fire. A serious kitchen fire could burn the whole place down. Many castles had been burnt down by exactly that, often more than once. The single most unpleasant job in the kitchen, and there were many to choose from, was the spit boy. The job, exactly as it sounds, was to sit by the fireplace and turn an iron spit on which large pieces of meat were roasting. This had to be done evenly, continuously, for hours, in temperatures hot enough that the boy was sometimes given a wet board to hold up between himself and the fire to keep his face from blistering. Spoiler: the wet board did not work as well as one might hope. The job was usually given to the youngest, smallest, and least lucky boys in the household. Some of them went deaf in one ear from sitting too close to the roaring fire for too many years. Some never grew quite right. None of them, as far as we know, ever complained in writing because they never learned to write. The hierarchy of the kitchen was almost as strict as the hierarchy of the hall, and people who imagine the medieval kitchen as a place of free-spirited improvisation would be surprised. The chief cook was a senior household officer, often a man of considerable skill, sometimes literate, occasionally possessed of his own household manuscripts of recipes. Below him were the undercooks. Below them, the saucers, the pasturers, the bakers, the brewers, the butlers, the larderers. Each had a specific responsibility. The pasturer ran the pie kitchen, because pies, both savory and sweet, were a major medieval food group, and a serious household ran through dozens of them a week. The saucer made the sauces, of which there were a remarkable number, mostly thickened with bread or almonds rather than flour. About the food itself, it is worth taking a moment to put aside the popular image of medieval cuisine, which tends to be either grim, endless boiled cabbage or absurd peacocks reassembled in their feathers. The truth was more interesting and more varied. A wealthy 13th century household ate well in its own way. They ate a great deal of meat when they could: beef, mutton, pork, venison, rabbit, hare, capon, goose, duck, partridge, pigeon, swan on great occasions, peacock as a centerpiece. They ate fish, an enormous amount of fish, because the church required meatless days Fridays, Saturdays in some traditions, all of Lent, vigils of major feasts, and Wednesdays in some monastic households. By one careful estimate, around half the days of the year were meatless in a strict observant household. So fish became a serious business, and the variety was impressive. Pike, perch, eel, salmon, herring, fresh, salted, smoked, pickled, stockfish, oysters, mussels, cockles, lampreys for a treat, sturgeon for a great treat. The larder was its own small world, stone-walled, kept deliberately cold, with a small high window for ventilation. In winter, meat could hang there for weeks. In summer, the larder was a constant battle against spoilage. Salt, that humble, fundamentally important commodity, was the great preservative of medieval life. Vast quantities of fish and meat were salted in wooden barrels, packed in coarse white salt, and stored in the larder against the long, meatless months. The salt itself came from coastal salt pans, from inland salt springs at places like Droitwich in England, or from the salt mines of Cheshire and Central Europe. It was expensive enough that taking the salt cellar from above to below at the high table, that gesture we mentioned earlier, was no small thing. Salt was wealth. Salt was survival. The bakehouse was almost always a separate building, again because of fire. A baker began work hours before anyone else in the castle was awake. The oven had to be lit, fed with wood, allowed to reach its proper heat, then raked out, then loaded with dough. A great household consumed an astonishing quantity of bread. Estimates vary, but a baron's household might eat between 1 and 2 pounds of bread per person per day, and a household of 150 meant somewhere between 100 and 300 pounds of bread daily. That bread came in grades: the finest white wastel and pandemain for the lord's table, coarser brown maslin for the middle ranks, dark rye and barley for the lower household, the leavings and stale loaves for the poor. The same loaf, in a sense, was shared by everyone, but in different proportions of grain and ash, depending on where you sat in the hall. And then there was the brewhouse, because medieval people, almost without exception, drank ale rather than water. This is one of those facts that genuinely shocks modern listeners, but the reasoning was sound. Water from a stream or a shallow well was often dangerous. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. None of these diseases were yet understood, but everyone understood that you got sick from bad water, and that you did not, in general, get sick from ale. Boiling the wort during brewing killed the worst of what made water unsafe, though no one in 1230 knew why this worked. They only knew that it did. Ale was made in 3 strengths. The first, running the strongest, called the first ale, went to the lord's table and to guests. The second, running weaker, went to the middling household. The third, running small ale, also called table ale or children's ale, was so weak it would barely register as alcoholic to a modern adult. This was what children drank, what the lower household drank with their meals, and what was given to everyone with breakfast and supper. A medieval person was rarely properly drunk on small ale. They were just constantly, mildly, well hydrated by something other than water. The phrase, "a man's daily bread and ale," in medieval English households was not poetry. It was a daily allowance, written into the household accounts, calculated by the gallon and the pound. The ale and the bread came to the hall not directly from the brewhouse and the bakehouse, but through 2 small rooms next to the screens passage at the lower end of the hall, the buttery and the pantry. The buttery was where the ale was kept and dispensed. The word comes from butt, an old word for a large barrel, not from butter. Butter, if it was kept at all, lived in the larder or the dairy. The pantry was where the bread was kept, pan in Old French, meaning bread, hence pantry. The butler ran the buttery. The pantler ran the pantry. Both were senior household officers, and both wielded considerable power, because to control the daily distribution of bread and ale in a household of 150 people is to control, at one level, the household itself. In the larger castles there was also a dairy, usually staffed by women who churned butter, pressed cheese, and manage the fresh milk supply. Dairying was women's work in the medieval North, almost without exception. It was skilled work, and it was respected work. A good dairymaid could earn a steady wage and a place in the household for life. The cheese she pressed sometimes hard yellow cheeses for the hall, sometimes soft white cheeses for spring use, sometimes the green-veined cheeses that have been made in Europe for over 1,000 years was a daily part of the household's diet, and it stored well through the lean months. I want to spend a moment, before we leave the kitchen and its outbuildings, on the herb garden. Because of the herb garden's small, walled, neat, often kept by a senior woman of the household, was the medieval pharmacy as much as it was the kitchen supply. Many of the plants in it were medicines first, flavors second, sage for the throat, rosemary for the memory, thyme for the chest, wormwood for fevers and for stomach worms, lavender for sleep and for moths, hyssop and rue and feverfew and pennyroyal and tansy and lovage, names you may remember from a grandmother's herb shelf, names that ran on in old recipes and old remedies long after most people had forgotten exactly what they had been used for. The lady of the castle very often knew more about medicine than anyone else in the household, with the possible exception of the chaplain. There was a small room sometimes called the still room, because it held the small still or alembic for making tinctures, where she prepared remedies, made cordials, distilled rose water, packed dried herbs for travel, and kept the household pharmacopoeia. In a real emergency, a physician might be sent for from the nearest town, but the nearest town might be a day's ride away. In the meantime, the lady held the household's life in her hands. This is not exaggeration, it is documented. There are surviving manuscripts of household recipes from noblewomen of the period, Hildegard of Bingen's writings being the most famous, though by no means the only example, that show a serious, practical, and often surprisingly effective medical knowledge. At the very bottom of the kitchen hierarchy were the scullery maids and scullery boys, who did the washing. The washing was endless. Pots, cauldrons, trenchers, pewter, knives, ladles, all of it had to be cleaned, often with sand and ashes and lye, often by hand, often in cold water that froze on the fingers in winter. The work was hard, and the wages were low, and the hours were brutal. Those who worked in factories during the war years, or who remember washing nappies by hand before there were machines for it, will recognize the texture of this work. Endless, repetitive, never quite done. The scullery maid scrubbing a cauldron at midnight, with hands red and cracked, was as much a part of medieval castle life as the lord in his furs at the high table. We do not have her name. We almost never have her name. But she was there. When the last meal was cleared and the trenchers gathered up, those soaked slabs of bread, dark with gravy, did not go to waste. They went out the back door of the kitchen, into the cold, into a small basket, and were given to whoever was waiting at the gate. Often a widow from the village, often a child whose father had been killed in a hunting accident, or who had simply not come home from a war some years before. Often an elderly man with no kin left. The castle, in this small way, fed the village. Not generously, not in a way modern people would consider sufficient, but not nothing. And on a bad winter night, not nothing made the difference between a child eating and not eating. We will come back to the gate and to the people who waited there when we walk out through the bailey to the outer wall. But first, there is another room we have to visit, the smallest, the quietest, and in many ways the most important room in the whole castle. We turn now toward the chapel. Chapter 6. The chapel, where the castle met eternity. The chapel hit you differently. After the noise of the hall and the heat of the kitchen, After the dogs and the dice and the smoke and the constant low rumble of 200 people sharing 200 opinions, you stepped through a small arched doorway into something else. The chapel was usually small. In a baronial castle, it might be no larger than a modest village church. In a grander castle, it could be a serious work of architecture in its own right, with vaulted ceilings and painted walls and stained glass that turned the morning light into colors that did not exist anywhere else in the building. But size was not really the point. The point was that the chapel was the one room in the castle that did not belong fully to the Lord. It belonged, in a sense, to a higher authority. And everyone in the castle, from the lord and lady down to the spit boy and the night soil man, knew this, in a way that is difficult to recover now, in a world where most people do not arrange their days around the sound of a chapel bell. The bell ran the day. It rang for matins in the small hours of the morning, when only the chaplain and the most devout were expected to rise. It rang for prime at first light. It rang for terce in mid-morning, sext at midday, nons in mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, compline at the close of the day. 7 appointed times for prayer, marked off across the hours like the milestones along a Roman road. Not everyone in the castle stopped what they were doing for each of these. The cook did not. The scullery maid did not. But the chaplain did. The lord and lady frequently did. And the rhythm of the bell shaped the household in ways no one had to think about. People knew what time it was, the way modern people know by hearing the same sound at the same time, day after day, year after year. The chaplain himself was a complicated figure in the household. He was a cleric, which meant he was technically subject to a different authority than the Lord the Bishop, ultimately the Pope. But he was also a household officer, paid by the Lord, fed at the Lord's table, dependent on the Lord's goodwill for his living. The arrangement worked, mostly because most chaplains were practical men who understood that they served 2 masters and tried to keep both reasonably content. The wise Lord did not interfere too much with the chaplain's spiritual duties. The wise chaplain did not interfere too much with the Lord's politics. When this balance broke down, as it sometimes did, spectacularly, when a strong-willed chaplain disapproved of a strong-willed lord's marriage or quarrel, the results filled the church courts for years afterward. The chaplain was also, in a way no one quite said aloud, the household therapist. Confession was a regular practice, expected at least at the great feasts, Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, and many devout people went weekly or even more often to kneel in a quiet chapel by candlelight and talk through one's failings, one's fears, one's nightmares, to a man bound by the seal of confession not to repeat what he heard. This was, for medieval people, an emotional release modern people often have to pay a professional for. We should not be sentimental about it. Some chaplains were cruel, some were corrupt. Some used their position for ends that have nothing to do with the gospel they were supposed to preach. But many were decent and patient men who carried, by the end of a long career, an extraordinary weight of other people's secrets, which they could neither share nor lay down. The chapel saw the household's whole life, not just its prayer. It saw baptisms. It saw weddings, though weddings, in this period, were as often performed at the church door as inside, with the actual ceremony quite short, and the public elements all about the contract between 2 families. It saw funerals, which were the chapel's most particular task. When a member of the household died, and people died, in medieval castles, with a frequency we have to make an effort to remember. Women in childbirth, children in their first year, soldiers from wounds taken on a campaign, the elderly in their winter beds. The body was washed, wrapped in a simple linen shroud, and brought to the chapel to lie before the altar for a night. The household, in turn, came to keep vigil. Even the kitchen boys came in their off hours to stand for a few quiet minutes by someone they had known. This was not optional. It was what a household did. The dead were buried, when possible, in the small cemetery just outside the chapel, a piece of ground consecrated by the bishop, often shaded by a yew tree planted for the purpose. Yews, by the way, are a particular medieval signature in old churchyards. They are slow-growing, immensely long-lived, and were associated with eternity in pre-Christian European belief long before they became associated with Christian graves. The yews you can still see beside old English country churches today are sometimes 1,000 years old. Some of them watched the funerals we are talking about. Some of them watched the Wars of the Roses. Some of them watched the Reformation. Some of them watched the bombs fall in 1940. They have outlasted everything we are describing. The chapel was also, for women in particular, a quiet refuge from the unceasing public life of the castle. The lady of the house, who had no real privacy, in the modern sense, her chamber shared with attendants, her meals taken in the hall, her business conducted in the steward's office, could come to the chapel alone, kneel before the altar with a small book of devotions, and have an hour to herself. The book might be a psalter or a book of hours, those small, beautifully illustrated volumes that we now see behind glass in museums, but which were once private companions, read until the corners of the parchment went soft from a generation of thumbs. There is something almost unbearably tender about the surviving books of hours that contain a noble woman's own marginal notes, in her own hand, a pressed flower, a name, a date, a short prayer for a dead child. I would be curious to hear, in the comments below, what those of you who grew up with a family Bible or a prayer book remember of that quiet practice. My grandmother kept hers on the same shelf for 40 years, and there were pressed leaves and clipped funeral notices inside it that traced our family history more accurately than any document we ever filed. That habit of marking a holy book with the moments of one's own life is the same habit that medieval women practiced in their books of hours, and it has not entirely disappeared. The forms change, the need does not. The chapel, in its quiet way, was the part of the castle that connected it to the world beyond the walls, to the parish church in the village, to the cathedral in the diocese town, to Rome itself, where decisions made by men the Lord would never meet shaped the calendar he lived by, to the dead who lay in the cemetery outside the chapel wall, to the saints whose images stood on shelves and altars throughout the building, to something larger and older than the castle itself. This was a worldview, not a hobby, and it survived, in some form, through every war and famine and plague that swept across Europe in the centuries we are talking about. There is more here than we can do justice to tonight. Later in our journey, we will pass the small alms door beside the gate and see how the chapel's mercy reached out into the village. But first, we have stayed long enough among the holy things. It is time to climb the stairs. Chapter 7. The Lord's Chamber and the Solar. The surprising truth of medieval privacy. To reach the Lord's chamber, you climbed the narrow spiral of the keep stair. You did this carefully, because the treads were worn unevenly by centuries of feet, and the only light was what crept in through arrow slits at the landings. You passed the chamberlain, who kept watch by the door not because the Lord feared assassination on a quiet winter afternoon, but because no one entered the Lord's private rooms without the chamberlain's nod. Even now, after all our talk of communal living, there were degrees of access. The hall belonged to everyone in the household. The chamber belonged to the Lord, his immediate family, his closest officers, and whoever the chamberlain decided was important enough to admit on a given day. The chamber itself was, in its way, the most modern room in the castle. It had a fireplace built into the wall with a proper chimney. It had glass in at least one window, small panes of greenish glass set in lead, often imported from the workshops of Burgundy or the Rhineland. Very expensive, very valued. It had real comfort. The bed, in particular, was a serious piece of furniture. The frame was oak, often carved with simple devices. The bedding was layered a straw or rush base, then a stuffed feather mattress, then linen sheets, then a wool blanket, then a heavy coverlet, and at the foot a fur, sometimes wolf, sometimes fox. In the grandest households, the white winter ermine that became a symbol of royalty. Around all of this, the bed curtains, heavy wool, often dyed and embroidered, closed the bed off into a smaller, warmer room within the room. But here is the thing: the lord did not sleep alone, and neither did the lady. The bed was vast, sometimes 7 or 8 feet across, because it was meant to hold not only the lord and his wife, but, depending on the night, a senior attendant, a sick child, a visiting noble brother, or the lord's body servant. Around the bed, on low pallets or directly on the rush-strewn floor, slept the closest household officers, the chamberlain, an esquire or two, a personal maid for the lady, sometimes a clerk who held the keys to the strongbox. The dogs were often there as well. The fire was banked, but never quite out. There was a candle by the bed for the long winter nights, when someone might need to rise to use the chamber pot. Now, let us return to the question I planted at the beginning, because we have arrived at the place where it must be answered. Remember it? The puzzle of why the most powerful people in their region, who had walls and locked doors and privacy, if they wanted it, almost never wanted it. The answer is not a single answer. It is several answers woven together so tightly that medieval people would have struggled to separate them. But here, in this chamber at midnight, with the lord and his lady asleep behind the curtains and 7 or 8 other people asleep within arm's reach, we can finally see the shape of it. The first reason is security. A lord asleep alone in a locked room is, in the world of 1230, a lord vulnerable to anyone who can get past a single door. A lord asleep in a room full of trusted attendants, with esquires sleeping against the door and the chamberlain in a chair beside it, is something else entirely. The arrangement was not paranoia. It was prudence. There had been too many cases even before our period, going back to the Norman conquest and beyond, of nobles murdered in their beds by jealous brothers, ambitious nephews, foreign agents, or simply by men who had made a bad bet and needed someone else's land to settle the debt. The household sleeping arrangement was a defensive formation. It was also, by long habit, simply how things were done. The second reason is warmth. We have to be honest about this. Medieval winters were cold. The Little Ice Age was just beginning to bite by the late 13th century, and even in the warmer decades of the early 13th, a stone-walled chamber on the upper floor of a keep in January in northern France or England was not the cozy refuge modern people picture. Bodies generate heat. 8 people in a closed chamber with a banked fire generate enough heat that the room is just about bearable. One person in the same chamber alone freezes. This is not a medieval eccentricity. Those who served in the Korean winter, or who slept in unheated farmhouses in their childhood, will recognize the principle. You sleep together because if you do not sleep at all. The third reason is something modern people sometimes miss entirely, because it does not match the way we think about ourselves. Medieval people did not, on the whole, think of privacy as a positive value. They thought of it as suspicious. A person who wanted to be alone, really alone, behind a locked door, away from witnesses, was a person who had something to hide. Hermits and anchorites, who lived in walled-up cells for religious reasons, were one matter. They were saints, or at least trying to be. Ordinary people who sought solitude were quite another. To be witnessed was to be vouched for. To live in the open was to live honestly. The Lord's life happened in front of his household because his household was, in a meaningful sense, the proof that he had nothing to be ashamed of. He ate in front of them, he prayed in front of them. He conceived his heir, when the time came, with attendants near enough to confirm discreetly, but firmly that the child was his. This last reason is the one most easily forgotten. In a world where most legal and political authority rested on personal reputation rather than written law, witnesses were the foundation of nearly everything. To swear an oath alone was almost meaningless. To swear it before witnesses, particularly witnesses of standing, was binding. To agree to a contract alone was impossible. The contract did not exist until it had been spoken in front of others who could later testify to what had been said. So the household around the Lord at all hours was not merely warmth and security, it was a permanent record, a walking, eating, sleeping account book of the Lord's word. Make no mistake, when the Lord said in his hall that he would grant a certain field to a certain widow for the rest of her life, the steward wrote it down, and the household remembered it. If anyone tried to overturn that grant after the Lord's death, the steward and the chamberlain and the chaplain and 3 or 4 trusted men-at-arms would testify in unison that they had heard the Lord say it with their own ears. That was how the world held together. So when we talk about the Lord's chamber and, by extension, the lady's solar, the smaller upper room set aside for the lady and her women, we are not talking about private rooms in any modern sense. We are talking about more selective rooms, rooms with fewer occupants, rooms where the closest, most trusted members of the household kept the Lord and lady company through the night. A solar, a word that simply means an upper room, lit by the sun, often the warmest room in the keep because it sat above the great hall and absorbed the heat rising from the fire below, was the lady's working chamber. Here she did her fine needlework, sometimes embroidering altar cloths or vestments that were the equal of any work in Europe. Here she instructed her daughters in reading, in household accounts, in herbcraft, in the careful diplomacy of a noblewoman's life. Here she received visitors of her own rank, other noblewomen, abbesses, occasionally a learned cleric. We should pause here for a moment, because the lady of the castle has been done a real disservice by the popular memory of the Middle Ages. The image of the medieval noblewoman as a passive, decorative creature waiting at her window for her husband to return from war is largely a Victorian invention and a self-serving one at that. The actual lady of a 13th century castle was a serious figure of administrative authority. She kept the household accounts, often in her own hand. She supervised the dairy and the herb garden and the still room. She corresponded in Latin if she had been well taught, in vernacular French or English if not, with relatives at other estates, with merchants, with abbots, with the agents of distant relatives whose marriages or inheritances mattered to her family's standing. When her husband was away, and he often was, at court or on campaign or simply riding to see another of his properties, she ran the castle. She held the keys, she heard the petitions of villagers, she authorized payments, she negotiated with creditors, she, in extremity, organized the defense. We have already mentioned Nicolas de la Haye, who held Lincoln Castle against a French army at the age of 65 in the year 1217. We could just as easily mention Blanche of Castile, regent of France for her young son Louis IX, the future Saint Louis, and as ferocious a defender of her son's interests as any general of the age. Or Eleanor of Provence, Queen of England, who recruited men and ships in her native Provence when her husband Henry III lost control of his own barons in 1263. Or Isabel of Conches in Normandy a century earlier, who rode in armor at the head of her men. These were not anomalies. These were the natural expression of a system in which the lady of a great household was expected to be capable of running it, defending it, and, if necessary, dying for it. A noble daughter, in fact, was raised with this knowledge in mind. From the time she could walk, she was at her mother's elbow, learning the work of the solar. By the age of 7 or 8, she was practicing her letters on a wax tablet, learning prayers in Latin, beginning to handle a small distaff or a needle. By 12 or 13, she could read, write a basic letter, do household accounts, manage a kitchen for a small dinner, and recognize the household's most important medicinal herbs. By her mid-teens, when she was likely to be married for a girl of high birth, marriage often came early. Sometimes painfully so, she was expected to step into another household and begin to run it. Make no mistake, the girl of 12 practicing her wax tablet in the solar today might, in 5 years, be commanding a castle's garrison while her husband campaigned in another country. We will get to one such young woman and her remarkable winter in the year 1226 later in our journey tonight. But before that, we still have rooms to visit, rooms that the noble women of the solar never spoke of in polite company, but which the chamberlain knew intimately. We are going downward now to one of the most necessary, least romantic, and frankly most ingenious features of any castle. We are going to the Garderobe. Chapter 8. The Garderobe and the plumbing nobody talks about. We have, until now, walked through the rooms of the castle that a visitor would have been shown. The hall, the kitchen, the chapel, the Lord's chamber, the solar, the rooms where the household conducted its public life. There are also rooms in a castle that no visitor was shown, that no minstrel sang about, and that, nevertheless, every single person who lived in the building used every day, without exception. We are going to talk about one of them now because to skip it would be to give a dishonest tour. We are going to talk about the Garderobe. The Garderobe was the medieval castle's privy. The word itself is a polite fiction. Garderobe in French means a place for keeping clothes, and in some castles, clothes really were stored in the alcove that contained the privy, because it was believed, with some reason, that the ammonia in the air would keep moths out of the wool. Whether this worked as well as people hoped is uncertain. What is certain is that the room had 2 functions, and only one of them was about the wool. A garderobe was, in its essential form, a stone seat with a hole, set over a vertical shaft built into the thickness of the wall. The shaft ran straight down to the base of the wall, where it emptied either into a stone-lined pit, into the moat, or, in the more poorly designed castles, straight out into the open at the wall's foot. The famous example is at Conway Castle in Wales, and at Chepstow, and at a great many smaller places besides. The contents fell. The smell rose. Both were managed as best they could be. Hygiene? Let us not ask too many questions, but honestly, let us ask a few, because the medieval answer was more thoughtful than people sometimes assume. In a well-built castle and the late 13th century Welsh castles of King Edward I are the textbook examples. The garderobes were grouped in clusters. A common chute served 2 or 3 privies, allowing more than one person to use them at the same time. Sometimes the seats were tiered, with multiple floors of garderobes emptying down the same shaft. The shaft ended in a pit that could be raked out and cleared by the night soil men, working naturally at night, when nobody was watching, when the smell would offend the fewest people. The work was foul. The work was essential. The men who did it were paid in coin and beer, and sometimes given lodgings in the village rather than in the castle itself, because it was considered impolite to expect them to sit at the same table as the people whose privies they emptied. This was a rough kindness, but it was kindness. The people who used the garderobe in the daytime did so quickly, and with as much dignity as a stone bench over a 40-foot drop allows. They wiped, in the higher household, with handfuls of soft wool kept in a basket nearby. In the lower household, with whatever came to hand: moss, soft cloth, sometimes leaves brought in for the purpose. Paper in any quantity was simply too valuable. The Roman habit of a communal sponge on a stick had not survived into northern Europe, though it had lasted in some Mediterranean places. The English and French preferred wool. The Italians, in some accounts, preferred linen. The Germans, in some accounts, preferred their own opinions on the matter. At night, when the corridors were cold and the garderobe was a long walk across freezing stone in the dark, most people in the castle used a chamber pot. The chamber pot was a humble, indispensable piece of household equipment: pewter for the lord and lady, glazed clay for the middling household, plain, unglazed earthenware for the lower staff. In the morning, the pots were emptied by the chambermaids, who carried them down the spiral stair, through the courtyard, and to the cesspit or the midden. This was perhaps the worst job in the castle. After the spit boy and the night soil men, it was also, almost universally, women's work. Those of you who remember nursing the very young or the very old before modern plumbing reached every house, particularly in rural farmhouses, well into the 1940s and 50s, will know exactly what this looked like. The empty bowl, the careful carry, the cold morning. Some things, in the long history of human housekeeping, do not change as much as we pretend. This brings us to bathing, which is another subject the popular image of the Middle Ages has badly mishandled. The idea that medieval people never bathed, that they were uniformly filthy from the cradle to the grave, that the period was simply a 1,000-year hiatus in personal hygiene, is one of those tidy little myths that survives because it makes us feel better about ourselves. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. Medieval people bathed. They bathed regularly when they could, and they bathed less often when they could not, exactly as people have always done in places where hot water is expensive and stone houses are cold. A noble bath. And we are talking now about the bath as it was taken by lords and ladies and senior household members, was a serious affair. A wooden tub, often round, was carried into a small chamber or set up in the lord's room itself, lined with heavy linen sheets so the bather's skin did not touch the bare wood, and filled by servants carrying buckets of hot water from the kitchen fires. The water was scented sometimes with rosemary or chamomile or rose petals. The bather had a small piece of soap. Castile soap, made from olive oil, was the prized variety, imported from Spain. Humbler soaps were made from animal fat and wood ash and were rather harsh. The body servant scrubbed, rinsed, and dried the bather with warmed linen. The whole business could take an hour. It was considered a luxury, and it was a luxury, but it was not a rare luxury for those who could afford it. The very devout sometimes bathed weekly. Many great households arranged a full bath for the lord and lady every 2 or 3 weeks. Ordinary household members made do with wash basins, hot water from the kitchen, and the regular daily wash of face, hands, and feet that all medieval etiquette manuals insist upon. For the lower household, the kitchen boys, the grooms, the laundresses' bathing was less frequent, but daily washing was not. A basin of cold water in the morning, a rinse of the face and hands before meals, a weekly visit to a public bathhouse in the nearest town, if the castle was near one, on a market day. In larger towns, public bathhouses were common. They were called stews in English, and they were used by everyone from carters to clergy. They had a reputation, sometimes deserved, for serving as social venues of a less reputable sort, but primarily they were what they sounded like: hot baths, herbal steam, a barber surgeon on hand to trim hair and beard. Those who fought in the war and remember the simple bliss of a hot shower at a forward base after weeks in the field will understand the appeal exactly. A hot bath was a small, recoverable joy. People walked miles for it. And speaking of hot water and labor, we should pause for a moment by the laundry. Because the laundry was one of those quiet, endless engines of medieval life that ran without much notice and without which everything would have ground to a halt within a month. A noble household generated enormous quantities of dirty linen shirts, smocks, sheets, towels, napery for the high table, altar cloths for the chapel, kitchen rags, swaddling for any infants in the building. All of it had to be washed. And washing, in the medieval North, meant boiling in lye, scrubbing on boards, wringing by hand, and drying in the wind. The laundresses, almost always women, were a small army of their own. They were paid well by household standards because the work was hard, ruinous to the hands, and required real skill. Whitening fine linen, in particular getting altar cloths to that pure cream white the chaplain expected for Easter, was a craft. The recipes survive in household manuals. They are not for the faint-hearted. All of this, the bathing, the washing, the cooking, the brewing, the cleaning, required water, and large quantities of it. A castle's water supply was perhaps the single most important strategic feature in the whole building. A castle without a reliable water source could not survive a serious siege, no matter how thick its walls. A castle with a good well could outlast almost anyone. Most serious castles by the 13th century had at least one well dug deep into the natural rock or earth on which the castle stood, sometimes hundreds of feet down. Some had two, in case one fouled or failed. The well of Beauvais Castle in northern France was over 300 feet deep, hand-dug, lined with cut stone, and still serviceable. The well of Burresheim Castle in the Rhineland is over 400 years old and still gives clean water today. The men who dug those wells, working in the dark with picks and buckets, are largely nameless, but they shaped the survival of every household above them. In addition to the well, many castles also collected rainwater in a cistern, a stone-lined underground chamber, fed by drains from the roofs. This was crucial in dry summers. It was also crucial in siege, when the besiegers might try to poison the well, a real concern and a real practice. There are documented sieges in which the attackers threw dead animals down the wells of villages they had taken, to ensure the defenders inside the castle could not use them. The cistern, sealed and inaccessible from outside the walls, was a second line of defense. It was rationed strictly during a siege. The constable kept the keys. We will come back to siege life later tonight because it deserves its own slow walk through the bailey and the curtain wall. But the point for now is that even the most basic feature of life, a drink of water required, in the medieval castle. Planning, engineering, and labor far beyond what we would imagine. Turn a tap today, and 1,000 years of dead engineers nod in their graves. Chapter 9. The stables, horses, hounds, and the animal heart of the castle. If the kitchen was the engine room of the castle, the stables were its garage and its motor pool. A great household ran on horses. The Lord's war horses, the destriers, those massive specially bred mounts trained to fight under armor, were stabled here. So were the riding horses for ordinary travel, the palfreys for the ladies, gentler-natured, smoother-gaited. The pack horses for moving baggage between estates, the plow horses if any were kept on the castle grounds, and a small string of less expensive but reliable rounceys for the men-at-arms. A baronial household might keep 20 or 30 horses in regular use. A great earl might keep over 100. The destrier, let us spend a moment with this animal, because it is one of those medieval objects that has been so romanticized, it has become slightly unreal in popular memory. The destrier was not a giant. The modern Shire horse or Clydesdale, which people sometimes imagine knights riding, did not exist in the 13th century. The destrier was probably between 15 and 16 hands high, about the size of a modern quarter horse or a heavier hunter. But it was extraordinarily strong, extraordinarily well-bred, extraordinarily expensive, and extraordinarily dangerous. It was trained from a colt to charge in formation, to bite and kick on command, to remain steady under the noise of trumpets and the smell of blood. A trained destrier could cost as much as 10 years' wages for a skilled laborer. The death of a destrier in battle was sometimes mourned as the death of a junior knight would be. Some lords gave their war horses names. Some made provision for them in their wills. The marshal of the horse, the marshal, in short, was one of the great household officers, equal in rank to the steward and the chamberlain. He was responsible not only for the horses themselves, but for the stables, the grooms, the smith, the harness, the saddles, the carts, and the carriage of supplies on the road. The word marshal itself comes from an old Germanic word meaning a servant of horses. In some royal households, the marshal eventually became a great hereditary office, holding ceremonial authority centuries after the actual day-to-day stable work had been delegated to others. The Earl Marshal of England, William Marshal, the most famous knight of his age, was named for exactly this office, which his family held by hereditary right. We will mention his story briefly later. He was a remarkable man, and the memoir his son commissioned of his life is one of the great documents of the medieval world. Connected to the stables, often by a short covered passage, was the smithy. The castle blacksmith was a man whose importance is hard to overstate. He shod the horses, and a horse without good shoes was useless on the stone roads and frozen ground of a medieval winter. He repaired the iron rims of cartwheels. He mended the chainmail of the men-at-arms. He sharpened swords, repaired helmets, made the iron fittings for doors and chests, the nails for everything that needed nailing, the hooks for everything that needed hanging. He was, by training, somewhere between a mechanic, an armorer, and a structural engineer. In some castles he was a free man with a contracted wage. In others he was a tenant of the lords, settled with his family in a house just outside the walls. Almost without exception, he was a man who worked from before dawn to after dusk, and whose hands, by the age of 40, looked like leather wrapped around iron. Near the stables, in many castles, were the kennels. The kennels held the hunting hounds, which were a serious investment in their own right. A great household might keep 2 or 3 dozen hunting dogs, greyhounds for the swift chase of the deer, scent hounds for the slow tracking, mastiffs for the bear and the boar, limerers, the lead tracker dogs, for the patient sniffing out of a quarry's path through the woods. Each breed had its own diet, its own training, its own peculiarities. The huntsman who oversaw all of this was another senior officer, and one who often had a closer day-to-day relationship with the lord than any other servant, because the hunt was, for medieval nobles, the great recreation, the great training for war, and the great social ritual all at once. And then, in some castles, there was a third small animal building, the mews, where the hunting falcons were kept. The mews was the cleanest, most carefully kept, most quiet building in the whole complex. Falcons need quiet. They need consistent feeding. They need a careful schedule of molting and training. The falconer who tended them was a man of considerable skill, and falconry, the art of training and flying birds of prey, was so prestigious in this period that even kings wrote books about it. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, wrote a treatise on falconry around 1240 that is still cited by ornithologists. The lady of the castle, more often than people now realize, had her own small hunting falcon, usually a merlin or a small kestrel, which she carried on her gloved hand even into the great hall, where it sat on its perch beside her at dinner, watching the room with the bright, unreadable eye that birds of prey have always had. The work of the stables ran from before dawn until well after dark. Horses had to be fed, watered, mucked out, groomed, exercised, shod, doctored, harnessed, unharnessed, and watched for the small signs of illness that mean disaster in an animal whose value depends on its soundness. Stable boys started young, often at 12 or 13, sometimes younger. They began with the simplest tasks, carrying buckets, sweeping aisles, raking straw, and worked up over years to the more skilled positions of groom, then under-marshal, then, for a very few, full marshal of a household. It was hard work, and the pay was modest, but it was honest work, and a young man with steady hands and a quiet voice with horses could rise in the world if he applied himself. Those of you who came up in trades through apprenticeships, through union halls, through years of learning a craft from older men who knew their business, will recognize the shape of this career exactly. Patience first, skill second, reputation third. The medieval apprenticeship was the ancestor of the modern apprenticeship in more than name. At the end of the day, the stable boys often slept in the lofts above the stalls, on the loose hay, with the warmth of the horses rising beneath them. It was warmer than the hall floor and quieter than the kitchen, though it smelled, as you might imagine, exactly like a stable. They slept the deep sleep of physically tired children, for children, many of them still were, and they rose before dawn to begin again. By the time the lord and lady were stirring in their curtained bed 3 floors up, the stable boys had already been at work for an hour. Those who served in any military mess, who came up through the night watches and the early shifts that nobody else wants, will recognize this rhythm too. The household ran because the youngest and lowest in it began the day in the dark. We will leave the stables now and step back into the cold air of the bailey. There is a part of the castle we have not yet visited, the part most people think of first when they think of a castle, but which we have deliberately saved for the second half of our journey. The walls, the towers, the gate, and the men whose job it was to make sure that none of the quiet life we have been describing tonight was ever interrupted by the people on the other side of the moat. We are going to the Garrison. Chapter 10. The Garrison. The men who held the walls. We have walked through the rooms where the household ate, prayed, slept, and washed. We have visited the kitchens, the stables, and the kennels. We have stood in the chapel where the dead were laid out for their vigil. Now we have to talk about the men who made all of this possible. The men whose job, day after day, year after year, was to make sure that the quiet life we have been describing was not interrupted by anyone on the other side of the wall. We have to talk about the garrison. The first thing to understand about a castle garrison is that it was, in normal times, surprisingly small. The popular image of medieval castles bristling with hundreds of soldiers belongs more to siege than to daily life. A modest baronial castle in peacetime might be held by perhaps a dozen full-time men-at-arms, a sergeant or two to command them, a constable who answered to the lord, and a small number of crossbowmen, perhaps 3 or 4, kept on retainer because skilled crossbowmen were expensive, and you wanted to make sure they did not slip away to a rival's pay when your back was turned. In a great earl's seat, the standing garrison might be 30 or 40. In a royal castle on a contested border, Dover, say, or Carcassonne, or craque des chevaliers in the Crusader states, the standing garrison might be 100 or more, with the capacity to swell into the thousands at need. The constable was the most important military officer in the castle, after the lord himself. The word constable comes from the late Latin cum stabile count of the stable, a title that originally meant the master of the cavalry, which tells you something about how horses and military rank had been tangled together since the days of Rome. By the 13th century, the constable's job was broader. He commanded the standing garrison. He maintained the walls and the weapons. He kept the gate keys. He set the watches. He inspected the stores of arrows, the supplies of grain, the condition of the wells. In the lord's absence, he held the castle on the lord's behalf, and in some cases, when the lord died without a clear heir, or when the king's officers were sent to seize the property, the constable was the man who decided, with terrible practical clarity, whether to open the gates or to hold them shut. The watch ran day and night, in shifts. There were usually 2 men on the gate at any hour, sometimes more in nervous times, and 1 or 2 on the wall walk, pacing the battlements in a slow, methodical circuit. At night, the watch was doubled, because at night the most likely danger came not from a full army but from a small party of raiders, thieves, or political agents who might attempt to slip in through a postern gate or scale a section of wall in the dark. The watchmen were issued horns, which they were to blow if anything unusual was seen. A horseman approaching at speed, a light in the village where no light should be, a movement in the tree line that might or might not be a deer. Most nights, of course, were perfectly quiet. The watch walked, the torches burned, the dogs slept, the hours passed. The relief came at the changing of the night, and the men coming off duty went down the spiral stair to the guard room for a meal of bread and broth and ale, before falling into their bedrolls and sleeping the hard sleep of cold men who have stood still for too long. We should talk for a moment about the equipment, because the men-at-arms of a 13th century garrison did not, on the whole, look like the polished plate-armored knights of the late medieval period. Plate armor, in the form most people picture from museum displays, would not really come into widespread use for another century and a half. The garrison soldier of 1230 wore a quilted linen gambeson, a heavy padded coat stuffed with raw wool or layers of linen, surprisingly effective at deadening the force of a blow. And, over it, if he could afford the kit, a mail hauberk of riveted iron rings. The hauberk reached to the knee and had long sleeves, sometimes with mittens or separate gloves. On his head he wore a simple kettle helm, a flat-brimmed iron hat, not unlike the British helmets of the First and Second World Wars, in shape, though without the chin strap or, in fancier kit, a fully enclosed great helm. He carried a sword, a long dagger, a tall ash-wood spear, and, if he was a crossbowman, his crossbow with its quiver of quarrels. Behind the standing garrison stood the armory, a chamber, usually in the gatehouse or the keep, holding the weapons not currently in use. A serious castle held in its armory enough kit to equip several times its standing garrison, because in a real emergency the lord could call on his tenants, the free farmers, the village men of fighting age, the journeymen and apprentices from the nearest town, to come to the castle and reinforce the walls. This was the medieval system of feudal levy, an institution that has been so badly explained in popular history that it is worth a moment of careful description. The lord's tenants owed him a specific number of days of military service each year, often 40 days, in return for the land they held from him. They came armed, in theory, with the kit appropriate to their station. A wealthier yeoman might come with a mail shirt of his own and a sword. A poorer man came with a spear and a leather jerkin. They all came, because not coming meant losing the land that fed their families. Spoiler, most of them came on time. These levied villagers were not professional soldiers, and nobody pretended they were. Their job, when called to the castle, was to stand on the walls, to carry baskets of stones to the battlements, to push ladders away with forked poles when the assault came, to repair the breaches at night, to fetch water for the men-at-arms who did the close fighting. They were also, in many sieges, the men who died first, because they had the least armor and the least training. The medieval military system was honest about this. The professional men-at-arms held the most dangerous points. The levies held the walls in between. The Lord's knights, the small corps of fully armored cavalry, rode out in sallies when the moment was right. Each had his place. The castle held or fell on whether each man did his job. There is a reason the constable's authority during a siege was nearly absolute, even over noblemen of higher birth than himself. Inside the walls in the hour of crisis, command was not negotiable. The gatehouse itself was the cleverest single piece of engineering in the entire castle. It was not just a doorway. It was, in the most developed examples, the gatehouses of the Welsh castles of Edward I, again, or of Crac des Chevaliers in the Holy Land, a complete miniature fortress in its own right, a stone trap that no attacker could pass without paying for every inch of ground. The approach to the gate was usually narrow, angled so that the attackers could not bring a battering ram up at a straight run. The drawbridge crossed the moat, sometimes a wet moat, sometimes a dry ditch, and could be raised by chains from inside, leaving any attacker stranded on the wrong side of a 15-foot drop. Behind the drawbridge stood the outer door of heavy oak, banded with iron. Behind the outer door, the portcullis, a toothed grille of heavy timbers shod with iron, which could be dropped in a moment by releasing a counterweight. Behind the portcullis, sometimes, a second portcullis. Behind that, the inner door. And above the entire passage, set into the ceiling of the gate chamber, the murder holes. About the murder holes, the name is unsubtle, and the function was unsubtle. They were circular or rectangular openings cut through the stone ceiling of the gate passage, opening into a chamber directly above. If attackers fought their way past the drawbridge, the outer door, and the first portcullis, and found themselves in the gate passage, the defenders in the chamber above poured down whatever was useful. Hot sand was effective. It found its way under armor and burned. Boiling water was effective. Quicklime, which reacted with the moisture in eyes and lungs, was effective and feared. The popular image is of boiling oil being poured down, but in fact oil was rare and expensive. Water was cheap. Sand was cheap. Stones were cheap. Most defenses relied on what was easy to keep in quantity. We are not going to dwell on the details of this kind of fighting. It was savage, it was effective, and it was, by the standards of the age, considered a reasonable and lawful means of defending one's own walls. We will speak more carefully about siege warfare in a moment, because the human side of it deserves more than we have given it so far. But on most days, and this is important, there was no fighting. There was no siege. There was no army on the horizon. There was just a man on a wall, walking back and forth, watching the snow fall on a quiet valley, blowing on his hands when the cold got bad, and counting the minutes until the relief came. For every dramatic siege in the chronicles, there were hundreds of thousands of uneventful watches. The garrison soldier's life, day to day, was less about glory than about endurance. The watch in the rain, the watch in the wind, the watch at 3 a.m. in February, when the only sound was the creak of the iron sconce and the distant cry of an owl. Those who served on guard duty in any army in Korea In Germany during the long years of the Cold War, in any quiet posting where nothing happened for weeks at a stretch, will know exactly what those hours felt like. Empty, cold, necessary, and remembered years later with the strange affection that men who spent those hours together sometimes share and cannot fully explain to anyone else. Chapter 11. Siege. When the quiet ended. Let us then turn to the moment for which everything we have described was built. The siege, the moment when the everyday rhythms, the bread baked at dawn, the chapel bell at noon, the watchman's slow pace at midnight, were interrupted by the sight of an army on the road. A real siege was a slow, terrible, mostly uneventful experience, punctuated by short bursts of horror. People who lived through the long bombardments of European cities in the war, in 1940 and 41, in 1944, will recognize the rhythm. Hour after hour of waiting, then a few minutes of something unspeakable, then hours of waiting again. The medieval siege was the same shape, even if the weapons were different. Most sieges did not begin with an assault. They began with arithmetic. The attackers, on arriving, did the first calculation: how many men in this castle, how much grain, how many wells, how soon will hunger force them out. The defenders did the matching calculation: how long until our food runs short? How long until our cisterns drop? How long until reinforcements might arrive? How cold will the next 2 months be? And then both sides settled in to wait. A medieval siege was as much a matter of patience as of violence. Some sieges lasted weeks, some lasted months. The siege of Acre in the Holy Land in 1189 to 1191 lasted nearly 2 years. Most ended not in a final assault, but in a quiet, grim surrender on terms the gates opened, the garrison allowed to march out with their weapons, the castle changing hands without the final, bloody escalation everyone had been dreading. The siege engines, when they appeared, were extraordinary pieces of engineering. The trebuchet, in particular, was the great long-range weapon of the High Middle Ages. It worked by counterweight at a heavy box of stones or sand at the short end of a long pivoting arm, which, when released, swung the arm up and around at tremendous speed, hurling a stone projectile from a sling at its far end. A good trebuchet could throw a 100-pound stone 300 yards. A great one, the famous siege engines built by the engineers of Edward I in his Welsh campaigns, could throw 200 or 300-pound stones nearly twice as far. The accuracy was, by modern standards, modest. By the standards of the day, it was uncanny. A skilled engineer could put stone after stone against the same section of wall for weeks until the wall came down. The defenders, of course, had their own catapults inside the castle, usually smaller, and a serious siege turned into a slow artillery duel that the army, with the better engineers and the more patient supplies, generally won. The human cost of a serious siege was high on both sides. The defenders died in ones and twos. As the bombardment continued, a man caught by a falling stone, an archer who leaned too far around a merlon, a woman struck while carrying water to the walls. The attackers died in ones and twos as well, by countershot, by sortie from the castle gate, by the diseases that always came with a stationary army in unwashed conditions. Dysentery, and what we now call typhoid, killed more besieging soldiers than any defender's arrow ever did. In the longest sieges, both sides watched their numbers melt away from sickness, while the actual fighting was relatively small. The human cost of medieval siege warfare was not the cost of glorious cavalry charges. It was the cost of dirty water, bad food, exposure, and the slow grinding down of bodies that had been in the same place too long. Those who have served in any extended military operation or who have read what their fathers wrote home from the long campaigns of the world wars, will recognize this part of the picture exactly. This is a moment to come back to a name I mentioned earlier tonight, Nicolas de la Haye. In the spring of 1217, with England torn between the supporters of the boy King Henry III and the supporters of the French Prince Louis, who had been invited in by rebel English barons to seize the throne, Nicolas de la Haye held Lincoln Castle for the young king. She was around 65 years old. She was a widow. She was the hereditary castellan of Lincoln, a position passed down through her family for generations. When the French and their English allies besieged the castle, she did not consider giving it up. She personally directed the defense for nearly 3 months. She was offered favorable terms to surrender and refused them. In May of 1217, when the Royalist army under William Marshall arrived to relieve the siege, they fought a savage battle through the streets of Lincoln itself. The French were defeated. The young king's cause was saved. And Nicolas de la Haye, 65 years old, having held a castle through 3 months of bombardment, was confirmed in her position by royal charter and lived on for another 13 years. Her name belongs alongside any general or knight of her age, and the fact that most modern audiences have never heard of her is a comment on how history has been told, rather than on what history actually contained. Historians still debate the exact details of her command. How much was done by her personally? How much by the senior knights who served under her? How much by the king's officers who happened to be in the castle? What is not in serious doubt is that she was, in legal and practical fact, the commander of the castle, and that she did not flinch. What is your take? Do you think we have done justice to women like her in the way history has been taught in schools? I would be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below, particularly those of you who served as nurses, in the WACs or the WAVES, who worked in the war factories or the field hospitals. Your own grandmothers and great-aunts held positions of authority and competence in wartime that have been similarly underplayed. The pattern is not new. It has been repeating itself for a long time. When a siege ended, as most ended without a final assault, the moment of surrender or relief was strange. The gate opened. The drawbridge came down. The besiegers, defeated or simply tired, packed their tents and their broken trebuchets and rolled away down the road. The defenders walked out of their walls into the open air for the first time in weeks or months. The first thing many of them did was look at the trees. The colors of leaves in late spring after a winter spent in a stone enclosure, the small ordinary green of an oak in May could move grown soldiers to tears in a way they could not later explain. In the months that followed, the masons would come. The damaged sections of wall would be patched with fresh stone, pale and distinct against the weathered older work. For a generation afterward, you could read the history of the siege in the color of the wall itself. New stone where the trebuchet had struck. New stone where the mining party had tried to undermine a tower. New stone where the gate had been broken and rebuilt. A castle that had survived more than one siege wore its history in patches of different ages, like an old soldier whose body shows the layered scars of 40 years of service. Most of those scars healed cleanly. The deepest ones, the ones that took out a section of curtain wall or collapsed a tower, were sometimes never quite repaired. You can still see, in surviving castles across Europe today, the rebuilt sections from particular sieges at Château Gaillard in Normandy, where King John lost his French inheritance in 1204. At Carcassonne, restored later in the 19th century but built on the bones of the earlier defenses. At Kenilworth in England, where the long siege of 1266 left marks that no later repair could fully hide. The masons, when they were finished, sometimes carved a small mark in the new stone, a simple chevron, a cross, a geometric mark identifying their guild or their workshop. These marks are still there. Anyone who has visited an old castle and looked closely at the joint between two sections of stone has likely seen them, even without knowing what they were looking at. They are the medieval equivalent of an engineer's signature at the bottom of a blueprint. The men who carved them were not signing for fame. They were signing because the work was theirs, and because in the medieval world, as in the modern, good craftsmen want their work to be known. We will leave the garrison now and walk out through the gatehouse, across the drawbridge, and into the wider world the castle was built to defend. We are going down into the village. We are going to meet the people whose harvests fed the household and whose sons sometimes filled out its garrison. We are going to talk about the relationship between the castle and the country around it. Chapter 12. The Village Beneath the Walls. We have spent the night inside the walls. Now, before we close the door behind us, we have to step outside for an hour and look at the world the castle stood in. Because no castle existed alone. A castle without a village beneath it was a building waiting to starve. A village without a castle to defend it was a community waiting to be raided. The two were bound together, and the relationship between them was one of the central facts of medieval life, more important in the day-to-day reality of most people than any king or any pope. The village was not, as some imagine, a collection of beggars huddled in misery at the foot of a great fortress. It was a working community of farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, most of whom had lived in the same place for generations, often in the same houses their grandparents had built. The houses were small, usually a single large room, sometimes with a partition for sleeping, and they were built of what the land provided. Wattle and daub walls, made of woven sticks plastered with mud and straw and dung, were strong, weatherproof, and warm. The thatch on the roof, of reed or wheat straw, was renewed every 15 or 20 years. The floors were of packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes, sometimes simply swept hard. Inside, a single iron pot hung on a chain over a central hearth, and the smoke found its way out through a hole in the thatch. The village had its own modest economy, independent of the castle, but tightly interwoven with it. There was a mill almost always the lord's, with the villagers obliged to grind their grain there in return for a small fee in flour. There was a bakehouse, sometimes shared, sometimes the lord's. There was usually a small brewery, often run by a widow alewives as they were called, were among the most successful businesswomen of the medieval village. There was a smith, who might be the same man who shod the lord's horses, but who in spare hours mended plowshares and made nails for the village. There was, in most villages of any size, a small market, often weekly, where eggs, vegetables, butter, cheese, cloth, candles, and the occasional pig changed hands for coin, or more often, for promises of work or barter. The relationship between the village and the castle was governed by a system that historians call manorialism, and that the people living under it would have called simply how things were. The villagers owed the lord a portion of their crops, a certain number of days of labor on his domain, the land he farmed directly, and sometimes a small payment in coin. In return, the lord owed them justice, protection, the use of his mill and his oven, and, in lean years, often quiet support from the household kitchens. It was not a relationship between equals. It was, on its better days, a relationship of mutual obligation, where both sides understood that they were tied together by the same land and the same weather. Make no mistake, it could be exploitative, and often was. A bad lord, and there were bad lords, could grind a village into ruin. A good lord, and there were good lords, could be the difference between a village surviving a hard winter and a village starving. The villagers' year ran on the rhythm of the land, plowing in early spring, sowing in spring, weeding through summer, haymaking in late June and July, the grain harvest in August and September, the autumn plowing and the planting of the winter wheat, the killing of pigs in November, the long quiet of winter, when there was less to do in the fields and more to do indoors, mending tools, weaving, repairing harnesses, telling stories around the hearth. Those of you who grew up on farms before mechanization or who remember your grandparents' farms in the years before the Second World War changed everything will recognize this rhythm immediately. It is not as distant as it sounds. There are men and women still alive who remember stooking sheaves of wheat by hand, threshing with a flail on a wooden floor, hauling water from a well at the kitchen door. The medieval peasant's year was not so different from what the early 20th century still knew. The parish church stood at the center of the village, often quite literally at the center. The green, or the market square, spreading from its door. The parish priest was a different sort of figure from the castle chaplain. He was, in most villages, a local man, sometimes the son of another local man, sometimes a younger son of a minor gentry family who had gone into the church for lack of land elsewhere. His Latin was often poor. His theology was sometimes shaky, but he baptized the babies. He buried the dead. He blessed the marriages. He visited the dying at any hour of the day or night, in any weather for any distance, because that was his job, and there was nobody else to do it. The village priest was, for most ordinary people, the church, not the bishop in his cathedral, not the pope in his distant Rome, but the local man with cracked hands who came up the muddy lane in February with the holy oils when somebody's father was failing. We mentioned earlier the small basket of trencher bread that went out the kitchen door at the end of every meal. This was part of a larger institution, the daily dole, the formal distribution of food from the castle to the poor of the village. In a well-run household, it happened at a fixed hour every morning. The leftover bread from yesterday's tables. The pottage of vegetable stew thickened with old crusts. Sometimes meat scraps in the colder months when the household was eating well. It was not enough to feed a family. It was enough to keep a widow alive through a hard month, or to give a sick child the broth his mother could not afford to make. In the strictest religious households, the lord and lady served the dole personally on certain great feasts. Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, was a particular tradition, with the Lord washing the feet of 12 poor villagers in imitation of Christ. Whether the gesture was sincere depended on the person making it. Some lords meant every word. Some did not. The bread was real either way. The relationship between castle and village showed itself most clearly at the moments of birth and death. When a child was born in the village, word reached the castle within hours, and the lady, if she was a good lady, sent down a small gift of fresh linen, a jar of honey, a piece of cured pork. When a long-serving tenant died, the household sent a representative to the funeral, and the priest read the names of the castle's dead alongside the village's at the great prayer for the souls of the departed on All Souls' Day in November. These were not grand gestures. They were small, particular, repeated acts of memory. They mattered because they were repeated. A household that did them year after year, generation after generation, earned a kind of loyalty that no amount of coin could buy. A household that neglected them, and there were such households, earned a sullen, slow-burning resentment that came out in poached deer, broken hedges, and, when the worst times came, in villagers who quietly slipped open a postern gate at midnight for an enemy on the other side. Chapter 13. Winter and the Long Quiet. To live in a medieval castle was, above all, to live through the winter. Spring, summer, and autumn had their own demands: the planting, the campaigning, the harvest, the gathering in. But winter was the test. Winter was the long quiet that everything else was built to survive. The wars stopped. The harvests were in. The roads froze, and the rivers iced over, and the world slowed, almost to a halt. The castle drew in on itself. The household ate stored food. The watches walked the snow-covered walls, and the long evenings stretched out, lit by tallow candles and central hearths, while the wind moved against the stones outside and tested every weakness it could find. The great festivals of the Christian year fell, by deliberate design, in the deepest weeks of winter. Christmas, the 12 days from the 25th of December to the 6th of January, was the longest sustained period of feasting and celebration in the medieval calendar. The household gathered. Visiting kin arrived. The chapel was kept lit through the long nights. The Yule log, a great section of oak or ash, was hauled in on Christmas Eve and lit from the saved coals of last year's Yule log, and was meant to burn slowly, banked carefully each night through the entire 12 days. The food was the best the larder could provide. The ale was the strongest of the autumn brews. The servants were given small gifts and time off duty. The poor at the gate received double rations through the season. 12th night, the 6th of January, was the great closing feast, with a special cake baked with a single bean hidden in it. Whoever found the bean was the lord of misrule for the night, a custom in which a kitchen boy or a servant could, for an hour, sit in the lord's chair and give comic orders that the actual lord cheerfully obeyed. It was a small, structured release of the long social pressure of the year. It made everyone feel better. It worked. After 12th night, the long quiet really settled. January and February were the hungriest months, the lean months, called by some historians the hungry gap, when the autumn stores were running low and nothing new could yet be brought in from the fields. The household lived on dried peas, salted fish, hard cheese, and bread of progressively coarser grain. The Lord ate better than the kitchen boys, of course, but even the Lord's table grew simpler in February. The fresh meat was nearly gone. The fresh vegetables were a memory. The cellar's ale was thinner than it had been at Christmas. Everyone from the Lord down to the night soil men looked forward to Lent for the simple practical reason that during Lent, by religious custom, the household ate fish from the fish ponds and the salting barrels, which actually represented a step up from the bone and dried pea soups of February. In these quiet months, the indoor work of the castle came into its own. The lady taught the children their letters in the Solar. The chaplain copied a small book of prayers for a neighboring abbess. The steward closed the year's accounts, balancing column against column on long parchment rolls. The chamberlain inventoried the linen, the plate, the spare arms, the stored cloth, the cured leather. The seamstress mended the household clothing for the year ahead. The smith repaired the small things that had been put off through the busy autumn. The carpenter rebuilt the trestle tables. The cook planned the spring menus and made his lists for the steward of what he would need from the spring markets. There was always work in a castle in winter. The work was simply quieter and slower and more interior. Those of you who have lived through a real northern winter in farmhouses before central heating, in army quarters in a winter posting, in hospital wards on the night shift, will know that quiet does not mean idle. The work continues. It simply changes shape. And when the work was done, and the candles guttered, and the last servants had banked the hearth fires for the night, the castle slept. The lord and lady behind their curtains in the upper chamber, with their attendants close around them, the senior household in their selective rooms, the middling household and the men-at-arms and the kitchen boys and the visiting messengers in the rush-strewn hall. the dogs by the fire, the stable boys in the loft above the horses, the watchman pacing the snow-covered wall, blowing on his hands, counting the hours until relief. The whole human community of 150 souls, breathing slowly together in the same building, sharing the same warmth, holding back the same cold and the same dark, until the bell rang for prime, and the day began again. Chapter 14. The Castle's Long Twilight. The castle as we have described it. The working, lived-in, household-centered castle of the High Middle Ages did not last forever. By the late 15th century, the institution was beginning a long, slow change. Gunpowder artillery, which had been a curiosity in the 14th century, was by the late 15th a reality serious enough to make the high vertical curtain walls of the old castle architecturally obsolete. A wall built to keep out scaling ladders and battering rams was no match for an iron cannon firing a heavy ball at point-blank range. The great new fortifications of the 16th century, squat, angular, low-built bastions designed to deflect cannon shot and to mount cannon themselves, looked nothing like the soaring stone towers of the high medieval period. The interior life of the castle changed too. By 1400, fireplaces with chimneys had largely replaced the central hearth in the Great Hall, and once the smoke had a clear way out, the hall could be divided horizontally, a second floor inserted, the smoky upper hall converted into private chambers. The communal sleeping arrangements of the high medieval period slowly gave way, room by room, to more private bedchambers. The household shrank, or rather, spread out. The lord's private apartments grew larger and more numerous. The retainers and senior officers were given their own chambers further from the lord. The lower household moved into separate service wings with their own dormitories, their own corridors, their own staircases. The old habit of everyone sleeping together, which we spent so much of tonight examining, faded over a century and a half, not in a dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small architectural decisions, each one closing off another small piece of communal life behind another small wooden door. By 1500, in much of Western Europe, the castle as a working military structure was simply no longer relevant to most aristocratic life. The wars of the great states had become the business of professional standing armies, not of local barons with their household garrisons. The royal authority had grown strong enough that private noble warfare, the small wars between neighbors that had once justified the existence of every castle in the countryside, was no longer tolerated. A baron who wanted to settle a quarrel with another baron now did so in the royal courts, not at the gates of a stone fortress. And so the castle became something else. In some places, a prison. In some, an administrative center. In some, a country house rebuilt for comfort rather than defense, with the old curtain walls dismantled to make room for gardens. In some, simply an abandoned ruin, the household having long since moved into a more comfortable building, somewhere lower, warmer, easier to heat. The buildings themselves, though, stayed. Stone is patient. Stone is honest. Stone outlasts the institutions that built it. The castles of the High Middle Ages stand today in ruin, in restoration, in the half-converted modernity of holiday lets and museum visits across the entire continent. You can walk through the gatehouse at Conway, where Edward's engineers built one of the most ingenious defensive systems of the entire period. You can climb the keep at Dover, the great square keep that has watched the English Channel for nearly 900 years. You can stand in the ruined Great Hall of Kenilworth and look at the place where the central hearth once burned. You can sit on a stone bench in the chapel of any small village castle in France or Germany and listen, if the wind is right, to the same silence that a 13th century chaplain heard before matins on a winter morning. The buildings have outlasted us. They will outlast our great-grandchildren too. So what do we take from a night like this? From these slow hours we have spent walking room by room through a building that no longer functions as it did, in a world that has moved very far from its assumptions. Several things, I think all of them worth carrying for a while. The first is that medieval people were not us in fancy dress. They lived in a different world with different priorities, different ideas about privacy, about community, about the proper relationship between an individual and a household. The fact that they slept together, ate together, prayed together, and accepted as natural a degree of constant company that would feel suffocating to us is not a sign of their backwardness. It is a sign that they had organized their lives around different needs: security, warmth, witness, mutual obligation, and that those needs in their world mattered more than the kind of personal solitude we have made central to ours. We are not better than them. They are not lesser than us. We are different in ways that are worth understanding before we judge. The second is that the castle, for all its stone and all its iron and all its violence, was not really a building. It was a community, a working, eating, praying, sleeping, fighting, dying community of 150 souls, bound together by obligations they would not have called feudal, because they would simply have called them life. The lord at the high table and the spit boy by the fire were not strangers to each other. They knew each other's names. They knew each other's families. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They lived in the same building. They breathed the same smoke. They drank the same well water. When the spit boy died, the Lord came to the funeral. When the Lord died, the spit boy stood vigil. This was not sentimental. It was structural. It was how the world worked. And it produced, for all its cruelty and all its hierarchy and all its assumptions we would now reject, a kind of human density of relationship that modern life has largely lost. The third, and perhaps the one most worth carrying, is that the people we have been talking about tonight were, in every meaningful sense, people exactly like us. They felt the cold the way we feel it. They worried about their children the way we worry about ours. They quarreled with their spouses and made up with them and quarreled again the way we do. They feared illness and death. They cared deeply and personally for animals and friends and parents and houses. They laughed at jokes. They held grudges. They lied sometimes and told the truth sometimes. They drank too much at Christmas and regretted it on Twelfth Night. They were neither nobler nor baser than we are. They were us in another century with different tools, asking the same questions we ask. How do we stay warm? How do we feed our families? How do we know if a friend is true? How do we forgive? How do we say goodbye to someone we love? They asked these questions in stone halls under tallow candles, surrounded by other people who could hear them ask. We ask them in heated rooms, alone, often into screens. The questions have not changed. The conditions have. I would like to ask, before we close, that you take a moment in the comments to share something of your own experience of these old buildings, if you have any. If you visited a castle on a trip somewhere, perhaps after the war, when so many of you traveled in Europe for the first time and saw places your fathers had only read about. If your parents or grandparents told you stories of seeing them. If you remember the cold of a stone room in a way that helps you imagine what we have been describing tonight. Or if, for any of you, the rhythm of communal life that we have walked through this evening connects to something you yourself lived through in barracks, in field hospitals, in shared farmhouses, in family homes during the years when extended families slept 4 to a room. Your stories are not a lesser version of history. They are history. And the comment section is yours. We have come to the end of our long walk. The watchman is still on the wall. The hearth in the hall is banked. The lady is asleep behind her curtains, with her attendants close around her, and the chamberlain dozing upright in his chair beside the door. The chaplain is reading his breviary by a single beeswax candle in the chapel. The kitchen boys are asleep in the straw above the ovens. The stable boys are asleep above the horses. The men-at-arms are asleep in the guard-room, one ear half open, as soldiers' ears always are. Somewhere in the village, a baby is being born by candlelight, with the priest already walking up the lane to bless it. Somewhere, an old man is dying quietly in his bed, with his wife of 50 years holding his hand. The castle holds them all, inside its walls and outside, in the slow grip of a winter night that has been going on, by now, for nearly 800 years. And in the quiet of history, their voices still echo, if we are willing to listen. They worked, they prayed, they quarreled, and forgave. They held their ground through winter after winter, generation after generation, until the walls outlasted everything they had built them for. We are, in our own small way, the inheritors of their endurance, of the patient mason setting the stone, of the lady at her ledger by candlelight, of the watchman pacing in the snow, of the village priest walking up the lane with the holy oils. They did not know us, but they made the world we were born into, one stone at a time, one harvest at a time, one quiet act of care at a time. Rest well tonight. The fires are banked, the watch is set, the door is barred, and the long winter passes, as it always has, until the bell rings for prime and the day begins again. I will see you in the next one.